So let's look at a new clause or function in Oracle 11g called pivot. I am in the SQL language reference and I'm going to go look for select. Once again, I'm going to go into the select statement and I'm going to blindly search for pivot. What does pivot do? Pivot means rotate something, if you like. Pivot from one thing to another. Unpivot, you can do it in reverse too. What it's doing is it's taking two-dimensional rows and columns, where the rows go horizontally and the columns go vertically. It's going to switch them. So in theory, you can take the rows and make the columns and the columns and make them rows. Works well for generic data, but it can be very complex. Let's click the pivot clause. All it says is pivot has an aggregate function which applies to the same thing or something similar to group by. Pivot for clause, pivot in clause, as alias, expression, and so on and so forth. I don't want to get into anything really complex with it. Unpivot does the opposite of pivot. So let's go and search for the description. The pivot clause lets you write cross-tabulation queries, much like cubes, that rotate rows into columns, aggregating data in the process of rotation if you want. So let's take a look at a simple example using pivot. First of all, pick data from the price table. There it is. Now go and pick data from the price table, but sum it by price grouped by venue. And there we have venue ID 179 is 3953, venue 5 is 156, and so on and so forth. We've got 4 rows. Now, this does the same query, but pivots on the price column to produce 4 separate venue columns. 179 is venue 1. It's renaming each venue value as a column header. Hit return. As you can see, that's what pivot has done. It's simply switched columns and fields around. Run it again. There's the result vertically. Here's the result horizontally. There's also an unpivot clause that can undo the process or work in reverse. The one thing you might have noticed when I was running that pivot example, that it was a little bit slow. I've seen pivot commands used in generic tables and also custom written pivot commands, quite often with generic tables in generic databases where you have the data about the data about the data, where the field names and the table names are stored in tables and information is manipulated and then reinterpreted. It gets really complicated. These types of structures can cause some complex problems, and it's difficult to educate people when hiring new people, and it's more elegance rather than practical. Try to reserve things like pivots for data warehouses and actually running out cross-tab reports in the same way that you would do with rollups and cubes. If you're switching data like that, you might want to revisit your data model and see how you're doing things, if you can actually change things the way they are. Useful in data warehouses, useful in reporting, useful in creating pre-constructed objects that you would use for reading data from en masse. But I would be cautious with them because it can create some serious performance issues. Elegance is not practical in programming, generally not, and commerce is rarely elegant. Not always the case. Most commercial environments are not rocket science, they're just accounting.